10. December 1941. Hashirajima Anchorage, Hiroshima Bay, Empire of Japan. The light shifted across the water in the quiet hours after noon, while Captain Matome Ugaki stood on the flag bridge of the battleship Nagato and listened for signals. He kept his diary in his pocket and felt the pencil against the paper as if the habit itself steadied his thoughts. The air was cold and clean. The gray hulls in the anchorage sat steady, their signal yards still, their anchors biting into the muddy floor of the bay. Routine sounds carried across the water. A launch engine coughed. A bosun called a brief order. Then the headphones at the radio table began to crackle with the clipped rhythm of coded Japanese Morse. Ugaki looked over at the watch officer and saw the quick motion of a hand, raised for silence. The message was short, and then another followed it. The second one firmer, carrying confirmation from a different station. Ugaki did not smile. He did not allow himself triumph. He only put one hand on the chart table and waited for the decoding officer to bring the strip of paper forward. The words were simple and final. An enemy battleship had sunk. A second signal said another had been hit again and again and was sinking. British capital ships were disappearing under the South China Sea in daylight. Ugaki closed his eyes for a moment and saw aircraft glinting above a long trail of white water and black smoke. He opened his diary and wrote a short note, the kind of entry he liked best, plain and exact. The enemy battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse have been destroyed by our air units near Malaya. He set down the exact local time as it was reported. The attack had begun around the late morning and had reached its violent end after midday near the coast off Kuantan. The first ship had rolled, the second had broken, and both had gone down in the early afternoon. He added a single line of feeling that he would later try to soften. The age has changed in one afternoon. From the shore facilities in French Indochina, the Japanese Navy had sent out the striking force that morning. Land-based naval air groups flying twin-engine bombers and torpedo planes had lifted off from airfields around Saigon and Tan Son Nhut, and from fields near the coast that engineers had improved during the autumn. They climbed over the brown rivers and the green paddies and the dark rise of the hills, and then went out above the gray water that led to the Malayan coast. The British ships at sea that day were HMS Prince of Wales, a new fast battleship of about 35,000 tons standard and over 40,000 tons loaded, and HMS Repulse, an older battlecruiser of about 26,000 tons. Together, the two ships and their destroyers were known as Force Z under Admiral Sir Tom Phillips. They had sailed to cover British landings and to threaten Japanese transports along the coast, but Japanese reconnaissance had tracked them. In the hours before noon, Japanese air units found the British ships and attacked without fighter cover on the British side. The numbers that would be written into official records were stark. The attacking waves amounted to roughly 80 to 90 aircraft from the 22nd Air Flotilla, including dozens of torpedo planes and dozens of level bombers. The first hits came from high-level bombing that near missed and bracketed the ships. The killing blows came from low-level torpedo runs made in careful spreads that forced the helmsman to choose between one string of wakes and another. Repulse died first after about an hour of attacks, rolled to port, and went down at around 12:33 local time. Prince of Wales took several torpedoes that wrecked her steering and power, and then more that broke her strength. She sank at about 13:20. Over 800 British sailors died. More than 1,000 survivors were picked up by the destroyers that closed in and dropped scrambling nets. Ugaki read those times again as he wrote them and felt his mind divide. one part keeping to the fray of the diary line by line, and the other part stepping back to see the shape of the day. He was an officer who liked order. He had trained himself to look at the sequence of events and see meaning in the order of small facts. He had read British naval history in translation and had formed his own careful respect for the tradition of the Royal Navy. The loss of a new battleship and a famous battlecruiser in a single afternoon felt like a page being turned with both hands. He did not raise his voice or show the feeling. Instead, he used the pencil again and wrote a second sentence in his diary that he would later underline. Air power at sea has passed a test against heavy ships without air cover. He thought of the crews in the aircraft that had done the work, the torpedo men who had trained for months in the shallow waters near Kyushu, the navigators who had plotted the search arcs, the radio operators who kept the link from the cockpit to the controlling station on the ground. He thought of the long logistics line behind those aircraft, the fuel that had arrived in drums from the home islands, the spare parts that had come by train from factories near Nagoya, the ground crews who had worked under lanterns in the early hours to warm engines and to arm the racks with torpedoes and bombs. He knew those numbers mattered as much as the number of aircraft in the sky. He knew that a single afternoon is built on many months of slow work. The wider view on that day stretched far beyond Hiroshima Bay and the South China Sea. Japan had begun the war with the British Empire and the United States only 3 days earlier. On 7 December, across the international dateline, the First Air Fleet had struck Pearl Harbor and smashed a line of American battleships in a single morning, though in that case the ships were at anchor and unready. That surprise attack had demonstrated a lesson in one way. The attack off Malaya repeated the lesson with a different kind of proof. The targets were modern capital ships at sea at speed, yet aircraft found and hit them. The result made sense to a mind trained on facts. Naval power had a new center of gravity. The carrier groups and the land-based naval air groups that could reach hundreds of miles now brought the decisive blows. The big guns and the thick armor of battleships were not useless, but they no longer stood at the top of the ladder of power. Ugaki knew this at once, though he did not say it aloud. He knew it because he could feel how the signals pulled officers in the flagship together and made them breathe a little faster even in a quiet room. It was not excitement alone. It was the sound of a belief loosening. On paper, one could see the logic. A torpedo that ran properly at 40 knots and carried a warhead of several hundred kilograms did not care about the nameplate of a ship. One well-placed hit near the engineering spaces or under the rudder could break the back of a ship that had been designed in a different era. Levels of armor were built for shells that came on predictable paths. Torpedoes could run under the edge of those belts. Spread enough of them from several points of the compass, and even a skilled captain would run out of water to turn into. He looked south from the chart table in his mind and set the ships into place by thought. The British pair at the point of impact. The destroyers turned in tight circles, the Japanese aircraft climbing out and turning for home, and behind them the many lines of the campaign that had just opened across an entire map. Japanese divisions were pushing down the Malayan Peninsula by road and rail. Landings had been made at Kota Baru and along the northeast coast. The amphibious fleet covered convoys with destroyers and light cruisers built for speed and lightness of touch. Behind these front lines, merchant hulls moved fuel, food, parts, and men. Between the rear and the front, there were the airfields. The geography of bases in French Indochina had given the Navy a reach into the South China Sea that tied together the air story and the sea story. In the language of order that Ugaki liked, force at sea now depended on the speed of aircraft and the range of airfields as much as the inches of gun bore or the thickness of armor. Yet the culture that had built the IJN was still rooted in capital ships. The chain of logic that ran from Mahan to the admirals of the combined fleet was a chain made of steel plates and heavy guns. A great fleet met another great fleet and decided a war. So the Navy had built two super battleships, Yamato and Musashi, with guns of 46 centimeters and armor belts so thick a man could stand inside a turret and feel small. Ugaki respected that tradition. He felt loyalty to the men who had chosen to lay down those keels. Yet the radio signals from Malaya cut through the habit of loyalty. They were a simple verdict. In one afternoon, two enemy capital ships went to the bottom without a single Japanese battleship in sight. He folded the diary and put it away, and then went out on the wing of the bridge into the light. The gray water caught small glints where the ripples pointed toward the afternoon sun. In 4 days, the newest and most secret pride of the Navy would be commissioned at Kure. Yamato would leave the building berth and take her place in the order of battle with a displacement that would pass 70,000 tons when fully loaded, and with 9 great guns that would reach to the horizon. Ugaki had already read the protected papers that described the range tables and the armor scheme and the capacity of the magazines. He had seen the arithmetic of weight and strength that naval architects like to present as a clean answer to messy realities. He had also watched carrier decks fill with aircraft and empty again in tight sequences that looked like carefully timed heartbeats. He thought of the carriers Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the light carriers that supported them. And then he thought of the land-based air that had just done the work off Malaya. He could feel the conclusion and yet would not write it in full sentences. His diary did not need to hold all of his thoughts in that moment. The quiet surface of the bay let him sense how fast change could come. He felt something else, too. He felt the weight of responsibility, because he knew that the same Navy that had just proven the power of aircraft would also send crews to serve and die in Yamato. The documentary view that followed the signals reached beyond the limits of a deck or a diary. The damage reports from Force painted a picture that historians would later put into pages of steady text. Torpedoes had struck repulse on the port side near the engine rooms and had opened her skin to the sea. She had avoided many earlier runs with fine ship handling under Captain William Tennant, but the massed torpedo spreads in the last waves left no room for escape. Prince of Wales had been hit early by a torpedo on the port quarter that wrecked her outer propeller and bent her shaft. That damage had caused flooding and a list, and had killed the power that ran her pumps and turrets and communication. She had fought on with emergency measures and had taken more hits that ended the struggle. The aircraft that made those hits included modern long-range bombers like the Mitsubishi Type 1 and fast torpedo planes that could skim the wave tops. They worked in groups under flight leaders who had learned the timing of the torpedo drops and the correct angles to make a cross pattern against a ship that zigzagged. The results were shown in the cold final sums. 2 capital ships lost in one afternoon. No Japanese ship even touched by enemy fire. The loss of life was heavy on the British side. The survivors were many, yet the shock at the higher command outweighed the arithmetic of men saved. In London, the news reached Winston Churchill on the night of Chapter 10th of December local time. He wrote later that he went to bed and found sleep had left him. His words would become a famous line in war literature. In a single day, he had lost the power of the Far Eastern Fleet. In Tokyo, the feeling was different, but not simple. The loss of 2 enemy ships was a triumph. The proof was also a warning that the tools of triumph were not the ones the Navy had expected to stand above all others when the war had been planned. Ugaki stepped back inside and listened as the watch changed, and the clerk carried copies of the signals to the cabins of the staff officers. He thought of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had believed in the carrier strike as the decisive hand at the start of the war, and who had backed the training for an attack on Pearl Harbor with a level of effort that some senior officers had first resisted. Yamamoto himself had started his career in gunnery and had known the smell of burned powder and the heat around a turret on a practice day. Yet he had changed his sense of weight of power as he watched aircraft grow in range and force. Ugaki had watched that change up close because he served as Yamamoto's chief of staff. He had argued with him over details and had agreed with him on ends. He knew that the First Air Fleet had now written its name into history in Hawaii, but he also knew that the land-based Naval Air Arm had written a separate lesson in the South. It mattered that the British losses came from aircraft that did not belong to a carrier task force. It meant the reach of air power did not live only on decks. It lived on bases that could be moved forward mile by engineering units, and that could then cover sea lanes where convoys and battleships moved. That truth did not fit neatly into old books. It made a map look different. It drew circles of range across water and drew routes for fuel and spare parts to those bases. It meant that a fleet could be hit by aircraft even if a carrier group was far away. The afternoon that had ended Force Z had set a new rule. A battleship without air cover was a target that could be found and destroyed. He wrote that rule in a private line for himself and then began to think ahead in the way staff officers must think ahead when the ink on one set of orders is still drying. In 6 days, Yamato would be commissioned at Kure on 16 December 1941. She would then join the combined fleet as the strongest single-surface ship in any navy in the world. Her main battery of 9 46-centimeter guns could fire shells that weighed over 1.5 tons each out to more than 40 kilometers. Her belt armor was measured in many inches, and her deck armor was layered in thickness, meant to break the nose of a diving shell and to keep the explosion above the vital spaces. Her secondary batteries and anti-aircraft guns would be added and adjusted as the war went on. All of this mass spoke one language. It said that a ship could stand in line of battle and hurl weight of metal until the other line broke. That language had made sense for decades, yet in his mind, Ugaki put another language beside it. It was the language of aircraft counts and sortie rates and ordnance loads and cycle times on a flight deck, and the number of torpedoes that an air group could carry to a target in 1 hour of flying time. He set 2 sets of numbers side by side as if in a ledger. He did not decide between them that afternoon. He knew that the Navy he loved would ask its men to make both sets of numbers matter. He also knew that the moment a battleship sailed within range of enemy aircraft without a screen of friendly fighters and anti-aircraft fire above it, the ship had already lost the protection that the thickness of its steel promised on paper. The broader strategic picture that surrounded his thoughts moved like a tide. Japan had opened a wide front in a single week and was now committed to a series of fast advances across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Industrial capacity at home was already stretched. Shipyards at Kure, Yokosuka, Sasebo, and Nagasaki were working at full speed on carriers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliaries, as well as on the great battleship that would soon leave the yard. The best pilots and air crew were already at sea or at forward bases. Training pipelines were under strain. Fuel stocks were limited by the flow from captured fields and by the dangers to tankers. In that setting, the day off Malaya had given a short-term victory that was real. It had also suggested the shape of the longer war. A navy that could mass aircraft could impose its will at sea, even without sending out a line of battleships. The United States Navy would soon bring carriers across the Pacific, with air groups that grew each month. The Royal Navy would regroup in the Indian Ocean. The mathematics of range and sortie rate and replacement would begin to matter more each quarter. Ugaki did not write that in his diary on that afternoon. He felt it in the pause he took before he put the pencil away. He watched the color of the light on the water and knew that the afternoon had joined the morning at Pearl Harbor to draw a single line across the month. In 4 days, a new ship would take her name and her flag. The world she sailed into was not the same world the designers had imagined when they drew her plans. Ugaki closed the diary. He walked down from the bridge and along the clean steel paths of the flagship, past lookouts who stood with their mittens tucked under their arms, past the door to the chart room where the smell of pencil and paper and tea always seemed to hang in the air. He returned to his cabin and sat at his small table and wrote a longer entry that he did not intend to show anyone for a long time. He copied the signal texts, and then he wrote a short paragraph that put the essential facts in one place. The British squadron composed of the new battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse has been destroyed off Kuantan. The Japanese land-based naval air striking force attacked in several waves. Enemy had no air cover. Torpedoes and bombs obtained many hits. Both ships sank around midday. He then wrote a sentence of feeling that he then struck through with a single line so that he could still read it later. The end of the big gun alone. He left the struck line in place and wrote one more sentence under it in calmer words. The big gun will still have its day, but it will never again stand alone. In 4 days, the biggest gun in the world would go to sea under a new flag. The same hand that would salute her as she left would also write more diary pages about aircraft that came in waves and tore open the skins of ships. That tension would define the years that followed. It began to define them in that quiet hour at anchor, while the signals from the south turned into text on a table and then into a line in a small book. 16th December 1941, Kure Naval Arsenal, Inland Sea, Japan. The morning mist clung to the cranes and the slipways as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the reviewing platform. The new battleship Yamato floated below, her massive hull gleaming with fresh paint, her turrets covered with canvas. At 72,000 tons fully loaded, she was the largest warship in the world, a floating fortress built in secret to embody the spirit and pride of Imperial Japan. To the men gathered on the pier, she was a symbol of naval supremacy, proof that Japan could match and surpass any Western power in mettle and will. The speeches that morning were brief, almost ceremonial, but in Yamamoto's mind, they echoed against the memory of Pearl Harbor and the telegrams from Malaya. In his pocket, he carried a report from the naval staff that listed the losses of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. He had read it 3 times before dawn and marked one sentence in red pencil. Enemy capital ships destroyed by air attack without loss of a single Japanese vessel. The ink was barely dry on Yamato's commissioning papers when that report arrived. It felt like a prophecy written too soon. Captain Matome Ugaki stood a few paces behind him, his face expressionless. He had been awake since before sunrise, writing in his diary by lamplight, while the cold seeped through the thin bulkheads of the staff quarters. "The world changes faster than ships are built," he wrote. From his vantage point now, the battleship's armor plates looked endless, her main battery of 46-centimeter guns pointing skyward, each barrel capable of firing a shell heavier than a small automobile. Yet even as the band played and the crew lined the deck, Ugaki's mind drifted to the airfields of Saigon and the jungled coast of Malaya. He thought of the torpedo squadrons that had sunk the British fleet and the calm precision with which they had done it. No ship of any navy had ever been destroyed like that before. And here, less than a week later, the navy that had proven air power's supremacy was celebrating a weapon that belonged to another century. The contrast felt sharp enough to wound. Yamamoto, too, sensed it. His face was calm, his eyes steady, but his thoughts were restless. He had opposed the war with the United States in private meetings, warning the cabinet that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but could not win a long conflict against American industry. Now he watched his Navy's ultimate weapons slide into the water, with a sound like the closing of a gate. The ceremony ended at 11:45, and by noon Yamato lay at anchor in the bay, her crew already testing systems. Steam rose from her funnels as engineers began running the turbines at low speed. The figures were staggering. 12 boilers, 3 turbines, 150,000 horsepower driving her through the water at 27 knots. Her main guns could hurl shells weighing over 1,400 kilograms to a range of 42 kilometers. The armor belt along her sides measured over 16 inches thick, her decks nearly 8. Everything about her design spoke of endurance and brute strength. Yet to men like Ugaki, who had studied the lessons of Taranto, Pearl Harbor, and now the South China Sea, those numbers no longer felt like insurance. They felt like memory. On paper, she could outgun anything afloat, but paper did not stop torpedoes. The British had learned that at Kuantan, and the Americans had seen it in Hawaii. Even the most heavily armored warships lay vulnerable beneath their waterlines, when aircraft could strike from beyond sight. The speed of change had outpaced the speed of construction. Yamato was already outdated, not by design flaws, but by a shift in the nature of war itself. The documentary view of that day extended across Japan's industrial network. More than 1 million workers, engineers, and laborers had contributed to the Yamato project since its keel was laid in 1937. Entire steel mills had been expanded to produce the armor plates. New forges had been built for the gun barrels. Electrical companies had developed power systems to control her turrets and instruments. The secrecy was immense. Even most officers of the fleet had not seen her plans until the final months of completion. Her existence was a national secret guarded as closely as the codebooks of the combined fleet. But outside the dockyards, the nation's resources were already strained. War had begun in China in 1937 and had now expanded across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Every ton of steel used for Yamato meant one less for tanks, merchant ships, or aircraft. The arithmetic was brutal. The Navy had spent nearly 200 million yen on her construction, a sum that could have built several fleet carriers or thousands of aircraft. As the war widened, that choice would reveal itself with painful clarity. Ugaki knew the number. He had seen the ledgers and memoranda from the Naval Ministry. He had also read the pilots' reports from Malaya describing the sight of the British ships sinking beneath plumes of smoke and spray. The handwriting on those pages had been steady, confident, almost cold. Enemy vessel rolled to port and sank in 5 minutes. No anti-aircraft fire effective. That one sentence said everything. No ship, however large, could survive against the sky. By late afternoon, Yamamoto and his staff boarded a motor launch to inspect the new battleship up close. The sea was calm, the gray hull rising like a cliff above the smaller boats. They climbed the gangway and stepped onto the teak deck, the planks still smelling of new oil. The captain of the ship, Captain Miyazato, met them with a salute and guided them forward. The corridors were wide and spotless, the steel walls freshly painted, the compartments lined with instruments. Ugaki followed, taking mental notes for the combined fleet's readiness report. The bridge was larger than any he had ever seen, with rangefinders and plotting tables built into the walls. The gunnery officer demonstrated the targeting system, a complex web of optics, gears, and hydraulics designed to calculate firing solutions across 40 kilometers of ocean. It was an engineering marvel, and yet all Ugaki could think of were the distances at which aircraft struck. The Japanese Type 97 torpedo bombers that had sunk the Prince of Wales had released their weapons from a range of barely 1,000 meters. At that distance, no fire control table, no armor thickness, no gunnery training could save a ship. He wrote in his diary that evening, "The guns are magnificent, but the enemy now comes from the clouds." Outside, the city of Kure hummed with wartime industry. Shipyard whistles blew, cranes lifted steel, and trains clattered through the nearby yards bringing supplies. Japan's naval expansion program had reached its peak. At that moment, more than a dozen major ships were under construction. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. But among the younger officers there was an unease that could not be spoken openly. They had seen how quickly the carriers had decided the early battles of the war. They had watched Akagi and Kaga launch their aircraft at Pearl Harbor, and now they read reports from Malaya describing the same pattern. Ships built to fight with guns were being outrun by wings. Yamato's arrival should have been a triumph, but instead it felt like a monument to a fading idea. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff issued statements celebrating her completion as a symbol of Japan's industrial genius. In private, some officers admitted she might never fire her main guns in battle against another battleship. The irony was heavy. The very success of Japan's own airmen had made her purpose uncertain before her first voyage. As evening fell, Ugaki stood on the upper deck watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The ship's massive shadow stretched across the water, toward the city lights. Somewhere to the south, transports were already moving toward the Philippines and Borneo. War had entered its second week. The Japanese army advanced rapidly across Malaya. The British Far East Command reeled from the loss of its fleet. In Washington, Franklin Roosevelt addressed the American people and promised a long, total war. The Pacific was already changing shape. Ugaki knew that Yamato's power would be measured not by how loud her guns sounded, but by how long she could survive in the new kind of war that had just begun. He looked up at the cranes lowering the last signal flags and thought of the line he had written 6 days earlier. The age has changed in one afternoon. Tonight, he believed it more than ever. 20th December 1941, Hashirajima Anchorage, Hiroshima Bay. The gray light of winter fell over the combined fleet as Yamato arrived to join her flag, her hull rising above the anchored cruisers and destroyers like a dark mountain. Admiral Yamamoto's staff transferred aboard that morning, the flag of the commander-in-chief raised on her mainmast for the first time. To the assembled crews of nearby ships, the moment looked ceremonial, another ritual of order in wartime. But for Captain Matome Ugaki, watching from the quarterdeck, it carried the quiet tension of a test. Yamato was not just a ship, she was a statement. Built in silence while the world watched other navies build carriers, she represented faith in the gun, in armor, and in the visible strength of steel. Yet the same week she became flagship. Japanese bombers were crossing the skies above Luzon and Wake Island, demonstrating again that the future of war was measured in miles of air range, not inches of armor. Ugaki's diary that night recorded the contradiction in plain words. She is majestic beyond comparison, but she belongs to an age already overtaken by events. The ship itself felt like a self-contained city. Her corridors stretched endlessly, lined with bulkheads thick as fortress walls. The crew, nearly 3,000 men, moved in ordered precision, their boots echoing on metal decks. The smell of oil and steel mixed with sea air that leaked through open hatches. When Yamamoto toured the engine rooms, he stopped often, running his fingers across the polished gauges. The machinery spaces hummed with 150,000 horsepower, power enough to push the massive hull through the water at nearly 30 knots. Yet for all her speed, she felt slow in spirit, bound by doctrine rather than movement. Ugaki watched from the bridge as the ship left the bay for her first sea trial, escorted by destroyers that darted like small gray fish around her sides. The world's largest guns turned slowly toward the horizon, their elevation gears groaning. He thought of the British sailors aboard Prince of Wales who had watched torpedo tracks racing toward them only 10 days earlier. The sea had swallowed those ships within an hour. The realization made Yamato's size feel less like power and more like exposure. The broader war moved fast beyond the inland sea. In the Philippines, Japanese troops advanced toward Manila. In Hong Kong, British forces were cornered, fighting among the hills of Kowloon. Wake Island had become a small symbol of defiance, where a few hundred U.S. Marines held out longer than expected against waves of attacks. Each report that reached the combined fleet reinforced the sense of Japanese momentum. But Yamamoto knew how quickly such momentum could fade. He spent his evenings reading intercepted reports of American industrial activity, the rapid mobilization of factories in California, the conversion of automobile plants into aircraft production lines. He told Ugaki one night in the wardroom, his voice calm but weighted, "They will build 10 ships for every one we complete, and they will fly 1,000 aircraft for every 100 we train." Ugaki wrote the words later with a note beside them. "The Admiral sees what others will not admit." Even then, Yamamoto understood that the victory at Pearl Harbor and the triumph in Malaya were flashes of advantage, not guarantees of supremacy. By late December, Yamato began full-speed trials across the Seto Inland Sea. Her gunnery exercises turned the horizon into a haze of cordite smoke. Observers noted that her main battery fired with stability no ship had ever achieved before. 9 shells, each over a meter long, roared from the barrels in a single salvo, shaking the sea itself. The sound carried for miles. When the spotting aircraft reported direct hits on the target area, officers on deck cheered softly, their pride unhidden. Yet even as the echoes faded, the staff officers nearby murmured about the reports from the Pacific. American aircraft carriers striking back at Wake Island, U.S. submarines appearing near the Philippines. The age of great surface duels was already dissolving into one of invisible strikes and sudden losses. Ugaki, ever the recorder of details, described the moment without poetry. "The guns speak beautifully, but no enemy will come close enough to hear them." January 2, 1942, Hashirajima Anchorage. The new year dawned gray over the inland sea, the sky a flat curtain of winter cloud that blurred the horizon. Yamato lay quiet at anchor, her crew gathered on deck for the first New Year's ceremony of the war. Admiral Yamamoto stood at the rail with his staff behind him, his uniform dark against the steel. The officers bowed toward the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, as was tradition, while the ships around them fired salutes in sequence. The echoes rolled across the bay like thunder. Captain Matome Ugaki listened to the sound and felt a deep unease behind the formality. Each gunshot reminded him of the old faith that the Navy still clung to, that steel and discipline could hold the empire together. But the admiral's silence told him something else. In Yamamoto's mind, the balance between pride and pragmatism had already shifted. As the smoke drifted away, Ugaki wrote one short line in his diary. "We have built the greatest fortress on water, yet the fortress cannot move fast enough to meet the war we started." Through January, the war expanded at a pace that none aboard Yamato could fully grasp. Japanese divisions landed at Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines and pressed toward Manila. Singapore, Britain's last major bastion in Asia, was under siege. Air power paved the way for each victory. Every success came with reports of waves of bombers clearing the skies before the army advanced. In those same weeks, the United States and Britain declared a unified Allied command. Roosevelt and Churchill had already agreed to a Germany-first strategy, but both men understood that Japan's expansion had to be slowed. American aircraft factories in California and Washington increased output to unprecedented levels. In December alone, the United States produced over 2,000 aircraft. By February, that number doubled. In a single month, America built more planes than Japan could in 3. Yamamoto received those intelligence summaries daily. He never shared the full figures with his officers, but Ugaki could see the strain in his superior's eyes whenever a courier brought fresh intercepts. One evening, Yamamoto said quietly, "We are winning in days what will cost us years." Meanwhile, Yamato's presence as flagship was both symbolic and practical. She carried the full communications staff of the combined fleet, her radio rooms working day and night, relaying orders to units across the Pacific. Her antennas filled the sky like a forest of steel. Every morning, operators decoded streams of messages from the Southern Expeditionary Fleet. The carriers moving near Rabaul, the submarine squadrons prowling the Coral Sea. The map room below the bridge glowed red from the lamps that illuminated the ocean charts. Ugaki often stood there for hours, watching the pins move south and east, Java, Borneo, the Celebes, New Guinea. Each pin meant a battle fought, an island seized, or a convoy destroyed. He saw how vast the empire was becoming, and how thinly stretched the naval air arm already was. Yamato herself did little more than float, a reserve force, too valuable to risk, too outdated to use. Her great guns remained silent except for training, her magazines filled with shells she might never fire in anger. It was a strange kind of power, one that looked immense but moved only on paper. "We are the shadow of old victory," Ugaki wrote. "We stand guard over a kind of past." By February, Yamato steamed south for training near Kyushu, escorted by destroyers and supply ships. The crew practiced battle stations daily, drilling for surface engagements that no longer existed. Spotters launched reconnaissance planes from her catapults, their engines whining as they climbed into the gray air. The sound carried far over the calm sea, fading toward the horizon. Ugaki watched one of those planes disappear and thought about the British crews at Kuantan again, the helplessness of great ships without wings above them. Japan's own victories had proven the futility of what he now served aboard. He still loved the ship, its discipline, its order, the precision of every drill, but he felt the future slipping away through the clouds. From the bridge, Yamamoto looked east, toward the invisible line where the ocean widened into the unknown, and murmured to no one in particular, "The day of the big guns will not come again." His words, caught by the cold wind, drifted across the deck. Ugaki heard them and did not forget. February 19, 1942, Hashirajima Anchorage. A cold rain drifted across the bay as Yamato's deck crews worked silently. washing down the teak planks and checking the heavy gun turrets that had not fired a live round in weeks. From the bridge, Captain Matome Ugaki could see the destroyers forming up around the great ship like sheepdogs circling a sleeping giant. The news from the south arrived by coded dispatch that morning. Japanese troops had entered Singapore. More than 80,000 British soldiers, sailors, and civilians had surrendered to General Yamashita. The empire was expanding faster than any strategist had dared predict. On the surface, it was triumph. Beneath it, those close to Admiral Yamamoto sensed a quiet dread. Each victory stretched supply lines farther. Each new conquest demanded more fuel, more aircraft, more merchant tonnage. Ugaki had begun to see the war not as a line of victories, but as a series of growing distances that the Navy would someday fail to cross. The fleet anchored at Hashirajima looked powerful enough to dominate the world, but every vessel in sight ran on fuel that had to travel through submarine-infested seas from Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. "Even strength must eat," he wrote that night in his diary, "and our table grows smaller each month." The broader war had entered a new phase. In the Pacific, Japanese forces had landed on New Britain and seized Rabaul, turning its harbor into a fortress that would become the forward base of the southern operations. Carrier strikes had driven deep into the Indian Ocean, hitting Ceylon and forcing the British Eastern Fleet westward. To many observers, it seemed Japan ruled an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. But the signals intercepted from American naval traffic told another story. The United States Pacific Fleet, though bloodied, was reorganizing. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown, now operated as mobile strike forces, their air groups training daily for hit-and-run attacks. The Americans had learned fast. In February, 2 U.S. carrier groups raided the Marshall Islands and Wake, bombing Japanese installations. The material damage was minor, but the shock it caused among Japan's senior officers was not. Yamamoto studied the reports at his desk aboard Yamato, tracing the paths of the American raids on a map. "They move like ghosts," he said to Ugaki. "Their ships strike and vanish. We still think in terms of lines and fleets." He paused, then added, "One day they will find us, and we will not be ready." On board Yamato, the rhythm of shipboard life continued with mechanical precision. Every morning began with inspections. Officers walked the corridors with notebooks, checking the gunnery divisions, the engine rooms, the fire control stations. The sailors scrubbed decks, polished brass, and oiled machinery that never rested. When drills were called, the ship came alive in seconds. Men running to battle stations, watertight doors sealing, the great turrets turning in unison. Ugaki admired the discipline, the almost ritual devotion to readiness. Yet he could not ignore the irony. Every man aboard was preparing for a kind of battle that no longer existed. He thought of the Prince of Wales again, of the men trapped below decks while torpedoes punched through their hull. He remembered reading the letter of a British survivor who described the water rising around the gun turrets as the ship listed, the cold weight of the sea pouring through ruptured seams. Yamato's armor was thicker, her bulk greater, but against an air attack, the story would end the same way. Ugaki began to realize that the Navy's greatest symbol of strength might also become its most tragic. By March, the spring rains softened the air around the anchorage. Cherry blossoms began to bloom on the hills above the base, and from Yamato's bridge the landscape looked peaceful. But beneath the calm, the Empire's momentum had begun to thin. The Imperial Navy had already lost dozens of trained aviators in the early campaigns. Replacement pilots graduated from schools in half the time, their skills untested under fire. The aircraft industry strained to keep pace, and the fuel stockpiles were shrinking faster than they could be replenished. Yamamoto rarely spoke of these numbers in meetings, but Ugaki knew he carried them like a private wound. The Admiral spent long hours on the bridge, smoking in silence, staring toward the horizon. When Ugaki once asked what he was thinking, Yamamoto replied quietly, "Every victory we win brings the enemy closer. They are building a storm we cannot stop." That night, Ugaki copied the words into his diary, marking them in red ink. The next morning, Yamato received new orders to prepare for sea, an inspection cruise that would take her to the open Pacific for the first time. The ship's engines came to life with a steady thrum, and her bow turned eastward toward the vastness that would soon decide her fate. April 5, 1942, Indian Ocean. The sea rolled deep blue beneath the morning haze as Yamato steamed slowly east of the Ryukyu Islands. She had left Hashirajima in late March, her first real deployment beyond Japanese coastal waters. Her escorting destroyers moved in neat formation, the wake, from their propellers drawing white scars across the calm surface. The world's largest battleship was finally underway, but her purpose was uncertain. Captain Matome Ugaki stood at the starboard bridge rail and watched the horizon fade into pale mist. Reports from the south came through the wireless every few hours. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force had struck the British base at Colombo on Ceylon, sinking several ships and destroying dozens of aircraft. The Indian Ocean raid was another demonstration of what Yamamoto already knew. Carriers now carried the war itself. Yamato, the floating fortress, served as the fleet's administrative center, a flagship without a battle. Her guns were ready, her magazines full, yet no enemy ship lay within 1,000 miles. Ugaki wrote in his diary that evening, "We glide through a sea without opponents. The sound of our engines is the only sign that we exist." At that same hour, half a world away, the industrial power of the United States was awakening at full force. In California, the shipyards at Richmond and San Pedro launched new Liberty ships almost daily. In Detroit, automobile plants were retooled to build engines and bombers. Aircraft factories in Seattle and Fort Worth expanded production lines around the clock. Between January and April 1942, American industry produced more than 15,000 aircraft and launched over 300 ships of all kinds. The scale defied imagination. The Japanese naval attachés in Europe sent warnings that went largely unheeded in Tokyo. "The enemy is becoming a factory with wings," one report read. Yamamoto received that summary aboard Yamato and read it twice, then passed it to Ugaki without comment. In the quiet of his cabin, Ugaki realized what the numbers meant. For every pilot Japan trained in a year, America trained 10. For every ton of steel Japan smelted, America smelted 50. He felt the slow pressure of inevitability closing in, like the sea around the hull. Yamato's daily life at sea was one of constant readiness and quiet frustration. The gunnery crews trained with mathematical precision, plotting imaginary targets across the water while lookouts practiced range-finding drills. The officers dined in the wardroom under the soft hum of electric lights, discussing battles that none of them would fight. Messages came and went through the communications rooms in a steady rhythm of code. Every few days, new orders arrived from the combined fleet headquarters at Kure, and every time the result was the same. Yamato would remain at sea, unseen, unchallenged. She was too valuable to risk in the open. To lose her would be to lose the symbol of Japan's naval pride. Ugaki began to feel the weight of that symbolism as a kind of imprisonment. "We carry the spirit of the empire," he wrote, "but we are forbidden to test its strength." Meanwhile, the carriers operated far to the south, striking across the Indian Ocean, raiding ports and convoys. The airmen returned as heroes, while Yamato's crew waited in silence, guardians of a weapon no one dared use. On the evening of April 9th, the day Nagumo's carriers sank the British cruiser Dorsetshire and the carrier Hermes near Ceylon, Yamato received confirmation through coded dispatch. Ugaki stood beside Yamamoto as the admiral read the report aloud to his staff. The success was complete. Over 400 British sailors killed, the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean broken. The officers around the table murmured in satisfaction, but Yamamoto remained quiet. He knew that even perfect victories could be traps. The British had lost ships, yes, but ships could be rebuilt. Air power could shift oceans. "It is always the first months that shine the brightest," he said softly. "After that comes the long struggle." He rose from his chair and looked through the narrow porthole at the darkening sea. The ship moved gently beneath his feet, massive, steady, and strangely irrelevant. The guns that had cost Japan so much remained still. The age of steel giants was over, but the men aboard Yamato did not yet know how to live in the age that followed. Ugaki closed his notebook, feeling the faint vibration of the engines and the weight of history turning beneath the waves.